Let's get started. Welcome to day number 3 of our post-growth food symposium. At first, I want to take a look back at yesterday. So yesterday was the keynote speech by Georgios Kallis and on limits and degrowth and environmental justice, followed by the session number 2 about food futures, the transdisciplinary processes and politics. And so in that session, we basically took a look at new forms of policy and governance engagements. So not only deliberating implementation of solutions, but actually going deeper and taking a look at the imaginaries and the visions that then craft these solutions. So we had some very interesting case studies there yesterday and some very good engagement on the Slack platform, which we hope for also today. Right, and I should introduce myself probably as well. So my name is Max, and I'm based here in Kyoto, Japan, with the FEAST project at the Research Institute for Humanities and Nature. And so I'll be sharing this session, which is on food alternatives in the present. And that will be followed then by the practitioner roundtable shared by RIHN. And questions for this session should be put into the Slack channel, which you can find under, let me check the exact name. So the Slack channel is called hashtag 15th session 3 food alternatives. And the one for the practitioner panel then is 15th Z practitioner panel. So if you have questions, please post them there. And in English or in Japanese, both is fine. We'll be able to translate those and accommodate a variety of questions. The way it worked so far is that if you post a question, the speakers themselves will try to reply to you. Maybe others will engage also with their ideas and comments, and we'll pick some of them to have them discussed and read out and talked about then live on Zoom as well. So we will contact you then if your question are chosen to be discussed live on Zoom. Otherwise, it will stay within the Slack space. Then also, I would like to point out that we are tweeting about this from the FEAST project account and from the Chikyuken account in Japanese. You can follow that. As well, there's, if you check the announcement channel, there's a link to a pad where you can collectively write food fiction. So the idea is that we don't only want to talk about narratives and stories, but also actually create a story, or a hopeful story around food, food of the future. And in the end of the day, there'll be a small social gathering in the spatial chat. The link to that is also in the announcement channel, but we'll post it again also later. It's a new online tool, which is kind of fun to engage in another different way, socially online. Good. Just wondering if I missed anything to announce at this point, but maybe we'll just go on now to the session. So today's session on food alternatives in the present focuses on practices that are hiding in the plain sight. It's in the pockets, the niches, the subcultures outside of the mainstream that oftentimes are maybe ignored or belittled or pushed aside or pushed out. But these kind of practices are crucial and relevant for the transformation and for the future. So one of the questions maybe is, should they move into the mainstream? Do they change the mainstream, or do they surpass it? Do they outdate it? Do they make it irrelevant? Do they replace the mainstream? And I think we'll see some of those questions answered for today in the different presentations. The first one will be by Petr Jelička from the Czech Academy of Sciences from the Czech Republic. It's an exciting paper he already posted in the Slack channel, and I think it's going to be a great presentation. Let's have a look.
Hello everyone, and many thanks for joining me for my talk on reimagining informal food practices. A lot of what I will be talking about is based on work I have done with my colleagues over the years, currently with my collaborators in the Spaces of Quiet Sustainability project, and I wanted to acknowledge this cooperation. The 15-minute format allows me to make 3 points on East European informal food practices, which I will refer to as food self-provisioning, and by which I basically mean food grown in gardens and perhaps on allotment sites and consumed in households, but also often shared with other people. I will start by a string of headline findings on East European food self-provisioning. Second, I will identify what I think are the key factors in marginalization of this knowledge in international sustainability scholarship. And finally, I'll argue for the need to reverse this trend, and I will show that European East should be read as a place producing novel and internationally relevant knowledge useful for reimagining the food system. Indeed, East European food self-provisioning is a widespread set of practices. In Hungary and Czechia, about 40% of the population grow food, and in Croatia and Poland, this percentage is over 50% of the population. It's also socially diverse. People from all educational and occupational backgrounds grow food. The difference between the percentage of people with primary education and with university degrees growing food is negligible. It's also evenly distributed across the class and economic status. And it's a generous activity. Many growers share their produce with other people, with work colleagues, neighbors, friends, and of course with their family. And importantly, nearly 1/2 of Polish and Czech household food growers produce non-certified organic food, that is, without using industrially made fertilizers and pesticides. Food self-provisioning is a form of strong food relocalization with the shortest possible food chain, from the garden to the kitchen and ultimately to the table. And we've also found that food self-provisioning has remained widespread during the period of growing affluence. For example, as Czechs became twice as rich in the course of 8 years, the percentage of people involved in self-provisioning remained the same and perhaps even marginally increased. And now a couple of figures illustrating the significance of household food production. In Czechia, in food-growing households, 40% of vegetables, fruit and eggs come from non-market sources, from people's gardens or received as a gift. And for the general population, the figure stands at 20% of vegetables, fruits, potatoes and eggs. To put these figures in a wider context, in Britain, food self-provisioning accounts for the consumption of 3% of fresh fruit and vegetables and 5% of eggs. What is important for this talk's argument is that Polish and Czech food self-provisioning is not primarily motivated economically, but by the desire for healthy and fresh food and an engagement in gardening as a hobby. Thus, what has emerged from our investigation of East European food self-provisioning was an almost ideal form of socially diverse, embedded, and routinized food-related behaviors that were compatible with activist and scholars' ideas about transformations towards sustainable food systems. And this is a model often promoted in agri-food studies under the Alternative Food Network's label. However, it was not how East European food self-provisioning was represented in international scholarship that had been until very recently written almost exclusively by Western researchers. There were no attempts in these accounts to include insights from this research to inform internationally recognized theorizations on sustainable food alternatives. Instead, Western scholars studying these practices up until the mid-2010s uniformly framed them as stories of survival, coping, hardship, poverty, and underdevelopment. Given that all scholarship is performative, it's difficult to expect knowledge on practices that are associated with these negative connotations to inspire others. And I want to draw your attention to the titles in the green bubble, and I just want to highlight the keywords like back to basics, crisis, poverty, and muddling through. In addition, knowledge on East European food self-provisioning produced by Western scholars circulated within the subfield of East European area studies, with little impact on social scientific knowledge more generally. Jennifer Sutherland described this tendency as a reluctance to incorporate knowledge from European East into global knowledges. This was evident in the citation analysis of 14 frequently cited articles on East European household food production that were written by Western scholars and published between 1993 and 2010. These 14 articles were mostly cited in articles in the subfield of East European area studies. It was so in 72% of cases. Whereas the percentage of these 14 article citations in general disciplines such as economics, geography, and anthropology was only 28%. It could be argued, therefore, that knowledge on East European household food production does not travel beyond the region and has only a limited impact on general academic discussions. Without claiming to have produced an exhaustive list, I suggest 4 factors that in my view contribute to this dominant, economically inflected and negatively valorized conceptualizations of East European food self-provisioning in Western academia. These 4 factors hinder the potential of this knowledge to become a source of new reference points on sustainability of the food systems, or its reimagining, if you like. The first factor is othering of Eastern Europe, in which the region is understood as a perennial recipient of knowledge and know-how from the West. One popular strand of research is to study how East European societies receive and learn imported alternative food networks initiatives in their role as passive recipients of Western-generated sustainability agendas. I believe that limiting the research on East European sustainable food systems to imported market-based concepts along the lines of alternative food networks has 2 effects. A, it obscures the diversity of food practices in Eastern Europe, and B, prioritizes a marginal set of practices over the more prevalent ones. In the developmentalist perspective, which is the second factor I want to identify, the post-1989 transformation of Eastern Europe was seen as a unidirectional process of development from a non-market to a market, from informal to a formal economy, in short, from tradition to modernity. There were disappointments among experts and academics that East European household food growers refused to transform into commercial farming, which was a process equated with development. And now I want to draw your attention to the green box. These assumptions confirm Doreen Massey's critique of the tendency in modernization discourses to conceptualize geographical contemporaneous differences as temporal sequence. To cite Doreen Massey directly, the multiplicities of the spatial have been rendered as merely stages in the temporal queue. And as a consequence, there is only one linear story of modernity, and the implication is that the future is foretold, it's not open. The third factor that prevented the reframing of the knowledge on East European food self-provisioning as inspiring, innovative, and transferable to other contexts, and thus as a source of theory, was the focus on poverty, shortage, and scarcity in social scientific analysis of these developments before and after 1989. The point I'm trying to make here is that one reason for framing East European food self-provisioning primarily as an economic rather than cultural practice was the overall tendency to read Eastern Europe as an economically deficient context. This economistic bias, prioritization of the economy in social scientific analysis, applied even to some anthropological studies of East European food self-provisioning, to which this is quite an uncharacteristic approach. This tendency was traced to the Hungarian-American economist János Kornai, whose work was influential beyond the discipline of economy. From the Western perspective, East European informal food networks were seen as an impediment to the development of markets rather than a sign of social resilience, innovation, and creativity, as in Western contexts. And they were not viewed as inspiring examples of creative communality and everyday sustainability as in the Global South. Importantly, as Martin Miller noted, unlike in the South, people have not found in the European East a source of alternatives to neoliberalism and environmental destruction. In other words, in contrast to the South, the East has not become a valued source of knowledge. This puzzle points to the need to consider the position of Eastern Europe in relation to the axis that marks the places where theoretically valid knowledge is created. And that's the fourth factor I want to discuss. From what I have said, it seems that Eastern Europe is located outside the axis that connects the former metropoles with former colonies in the circuits of international accepted universal knowledge. Jennifer Robinson claimed that very few places that have the power to make knowledge originating there to travel most effectively and thus become theory. It seems that this claim should be extended in the sense that these places also get the power to select which contexts outside the Western core will be included in the set of theory-generating contexts. And it's all clear that the European East and its everyday food practices, such as food self-provisioning, have not been included in the range of settings in which theory on food system sustainability is created, despite these practices' strong sustainability credentials. I think it's useful here to remind ourselves of Martin Miller's observation in the green box. In the global circulation of science, the East is not nearly as legible as the global South, where colonialism has created shared languages, institutions, knowledge systems, and social bonds. Uganda is more easily knowable in the global centers of media and scholarship than Ukraine. Chile is more familiar than Czechia, and Laos is closer than Latvia. What does all this matter? Why is it important to understand this missed opportunity or lessons from Eastern Europe that have not been learned? There are two things, I think. First, the gravity of global environmental crisis, to which the mainstream northern food system contributes a great deal, requires searching for responses in all social contexts, not just in the West or the center, where the conventional notion of sustainability was coined and the search for sustainable food system is being conducted. And second, and relatedly, there's a need to find ways of making the flow of scholarly communication multidirectional, as opposed to the unidirectional flow from the West to the rest, that means to the South, to the East, and so on, while keeping in mind the power structure behind theory production. Despite the somewhat bleak picture I've been painting in this presentation, I'd like to end on a positive note and highlight a couple of points for reimagining the food system derived from the research in Eastern Europe and on informal food practices. One thing we have found is that established and socially embedded sustainable practices, such as food self-provisioning, do not necessarily disappear with increased affluence. So perhaps there are some important lessons here on the enmeshing of informal food practices with rapid marketization, and therefore significant findings for societies such as post-Soviet countries or China and Vietnam. Second, scholarship on East European food self-provisioning invites us to reimagine the food system to include informal, everyday, non-market forms of behavior and consider how they fit in and interact with the market-based forms of sustainable consumption. And in our thinking about sustainability, it invites us to go beyond intentionality of sustainable behaviors, to include sustainability by outcome rather than intention, what Joe Smith and I termed quiet sustainability some time ago. It also invites us to extend the notion of sustainability beyond those based on constraints and limitations, and therefore to include sustainable behaviors that are associated with joy, pleasure, and exuberance. And very importantly, I think, we usually think of sustainability as an outcome of developing something new, creative, innovative, and perhaps driven by technology. And I would argue that we should start considering the implications of possible losses of already existing informal food practices for sustainability. For example, what would be the outcome if millions of East Europeans cease to grow and share homegrown food? I think we can guess that it would be greater marketization, longer food miles, longer food supply chains, with all attendant environmental impacts. That was the final point I wanted to make. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And I think it connects very well to already some of the other presentations that we have seen in the last 2 days, where larger frameworks are limiting the imaginary and are framing behavior and practices into certain boxes where they maybe shouldn't be, and thereby get totally neglected and discounted. So it's a good starting for today, I feel. And we want to just continue with the presentation by Marlene Sahakian, based in the University of Geneva, Switzerland. So Marlene is going to talk about consumption in everyday life. Let's have a look at that one.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marlene Sahakian, and I'm delighted to be presenting to you today results of a project on healthy and sustainable food consumption in Switzerland. So I will just show you my slides here. The project was done between the University of Geneva, the University of Lausanne, EPFL, and Qantas International. And I'm going to focus today on how prescriptions inform our understanding of healthy and sustainable food. So first of all, many of us attending this symposium are well aware of the environmental and health impacts of diets. The Eat Lancet report, for example, underlined placed emphasis on how meat consumption contributes to biodiversity loss, carbon emissions, land usage issues, but also excessive meat consumption can have a negative impact on human health. But many of us also working, in the fields of the disciplines of sociology or anthropology or in food studies more generally also recognize the cultural significance of food. So I'm based in Switzerland, where the fondue is very much an emblematic dish based on melted cheese. And on the right, you see a cow in alpine pastures. So this idea of the cow is very much tied up with our national identity here in Switzerland. So what did we want to do in this project? We wanted to move from a current state to a future state of healthy and sustainable Swiss diets. And we did that by trying to gain different forms of knowledge: system knowledge, goal knowledge, and transformative knowledge. And the project really had two focus areas. On the one hand, we wanted to understand consumption as a social practice, so not as an individual action, but rather tied up with social interactions, meanings, prescriptions, etc. We also wanted to account for both the environmental and health impacts of diets across life cycles, and this is where our partner, Qantas International, came in. So what do I mean by consumption as a practice? Well, oftentimes when it comes to imagining how one might change a diet, typically, we tend to imagine that individuals need to make better choices and maybe more rational choices. In this project, we weren't so much interested in what people want to do or what they believe they want to do. Rather, we wanted to look at the doings and sayings that make up everyday life in relation to food. So the practice of food provisioning, the practice of preparing meals, sharing meals, etc. And these practices always include a series of elements that come together. So what I've called here the sociocultural dimension, the prescriptions and the norms that tell us how we should eat food or what we should or shouldn't eat. People's dispositions, their emotions, competencies, representations, etc., but also the material dimension of everything that has to do with eating. So our access to certain types of food products or different spaces of consumption and retail, etc. So the way you understand the problem and the conceptual framework you apply to the problem will, of course, inform how you then understand change. So here, change in this project was not about changing individual people, but really trying to figure out how practices could be shifted towards sustainable and healthy diets. And we placed a very specific emphasis in this project on prescriptions because we realized from the beginning that there were many different prescriptions telling people how they should eat, what should be a healthy diet or a balanced diet, for example. And so that was one of the first things we did in the project, was try to identify all of the different prescriptions that are out there. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So to sort of show you the interdisciplinary approach of combining life cycle assessments on the left with more of a sociological approach to practices on the right, what we took as a starting point or a common point were these food prescriptions, so what people believe to be healthy and sustainable diets. But we also looked at data on actual diets. I'll come back to that in a moment. And from there, we then tried to understand how the prescriptions play out in practice, but also try to assess the impacts of different diets in relation to those prescriptions. So this is a slide that Qantas has provided. It's about how they went from actual diets Menu CH is the first survey of actual consumption patterns in Switzerland based on memory recall methods. They took that data, they looked at the prescriptions we identified in the project, and then they focused on two specific variables in their life cycle analysis: carbon footprints and human health. So I think the innovation of this project was to integrate health impacts with LCA environmental impacts. So here are the prescriptions that we found in Switzerland. Without, let's say, without much surprise, B, the brown circle that you see here, represents the idea that people feel that a healthy and sustainable diet is about eating a balanced meal. And this is very much represented in images such as the Swiss food pyramid. But we were surprised to see that eating as pleasure and conviviality was also a very strong prescription in Switzerland. This means that you can't simply replace a meal with, vitamin pills or different forms of smart food. People really, in certain instances, seem to enjoy preparing meals and sharing meals. But here you also see that certain prescriptions are in tension, these two orange spheres. So on the left, you have the idea of eating less meat, but potentially better meat, which implies Swiss meat. But to the right there, sphere F is about vegetarian and vegan diets. And many people are sort of in a transition between the two, or going from eating less of better meat towards vegetarian and vegan diets. But of course, for many people following a vegan diet, they see their diets as really opposed to the concept or idea of eating meat. Two other prescriptions that are in sort of crossover are the idea of eating not natural and organic diets, which sort of sometimes can also imply local and seasonal diets, but not always. And here we can talk about food cacophony. People are quite confused. Should they be buying organic avocados that have come from overseas, or privileging local food? And as I'll come back to later, this prescription around local and seasonal food is increasingly becoming a proxy for what it means to eat sustainably here in Switzerland. We focused in one article, in case you're interested, on the specific question of meat, because we found that meat really is tied to a very emotional register. So the pro-meat people in Switzerland speak about meat as a form of tradition and cultural heritage and national pride. And of course, vegans and vegetarians have a very different message, focusing on emotions around empathy for animals, and in some cases disgust around the way animals are treated. Here I've shown an image of the nose to tail movement in Switzerland. So there is also this increasing idea that rather than creating new sources of protein through insects, etc., which in Switzerland is very much sort of steered by entrepreneurs rather than social associations, organizations. Rather than wasting meat by only privileging the better cuts, there is this trend now to want to privilege eating all of the animal, and so not only sirloin steak, as it says here in the image. So this is a analysis of impacts that Qantas did based on the different prescriptions that we came up with. So they tried to look at an average diet, as well as vegetarian and vegan diets. And at the bottom there, you see all of the different food categories that are involved. So meat, fish, whole grains, etc. What's interesting here, maybe some of you have heard of this idea of a one-ton lifestyle. Well, in Switzerland today, even vegan diets exceed a one-ton lifestyle. And one-ton lifestyles are supposed to include not only food consumption, but also mobility, heating, etc. So what we can get from this slide is that indeed, we should be consuming less meat in terms of carbon emissions. We also see that men tend to consume more meat or have higher impacts in general than women. So there's a gender dimension to environmental impacts here, but also that it maybe isn't about consumer choice, what we're seeing here is that systems of provision, food production are factors that are included in relation to environmental impact. So the fact that we're importing feed for animals and also importing meat in some cases is why you see such high level impacts, but not only for meats, for vegetables, cereals, and other products that are imported as well. So we also looked at health risks and benefits, and this was done in relation to dailies, disability adjusted life years, so basically complicated calculations that tell us what you stand to gain or lose in terms of lifespan and human health. And what we found here is that clearly whole grains have a positive impact on health, but we could also think of processed meat as a target intervention area. So to conclude this section, in focusing on prescriptions and practices and also accounting for environmental impacts, we found that it's important to look at interrelated practices. So it's not just about food provisioning, it's not only about preparing meals and managing waste and these kinds of things. Food is also related to work-life balance, caring for children, mobility practices, etc. So we also found that it would be important to place more attention on food environments and systems of provision. As I said earlier, it's not just about individuals choosing to eat more vegetarian or have less meat consumption in their diets, but it's about individuals being able to purchase foods that have that are perhaps not processed, that haven't been imported or more locally produced, etc. And then we found, similar to other research projects, that there are key life stages and events that could be critical tipping points in terms of changing people's food consumption, moving to a new location where you might have access to a farmer's market or health concerns. These are all sort of triggers that could prompt a change in how you eat. So to conclude, what we wanted to bring forward in this project is the need to establish a food policy forum. So this is something that has also emerged in other contexts because of the complex nature of food and how it cuts across different sectors and policy sectors, but also across different practices. Bringing together an intersectoral and transdisciplinary policy forum in Switzerland would be highly valuable, and it would involve not only thinking about food in relation to agriculture, but also potentially mobility, urban planning, etc. We found that a lot of people are buying food on their way from the workplace to home, for example, perhaps less so now in these times of semi-confinement. So thinking about how mobility integrates with healthy and sustainable diets is increasingly important. But this also means that we have to account for the multiple dimensions of food. So it is about human health, it is about environmental impacts, but it's also about urban planning, mobility, etc. Another key finding was that to promote healthy and sustainable dietary goals, perhaps we do not need more labels and more prescriptions, but we could focus on prescriptions that are seen as let's say proxies for more sustainable and healthy eating. In our case, the idea of local and seasonal food is a very strong prescription when it comes to healthy and sustainable food, but also the trend of eating less of better meat. So better meat often implies, in our case, Swiss meat. So there is some, protectionist undertones that we should be wary of. We must also be thinking of food in terms of solidarity with producers in other parts of the world, but certainly more and more people are seeing Swiss food production as one way of addressing health issues in terms of trusting your systems of provision, but also environmental impacts. The other key message we wanted to put forward is that perhaps rather than focusing on the reduction of unhealthy and unsustainable products, we could encourage the increased consumption of healthy and low environmental impact foods. So whole grains, for example, whole grain bread, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and legumes. So these are all things that Swiss people are apparently not eating enough of and should be eating more of. I've included here a few references that I've cited in the text. There's also a project website in French, but it has a link to a brochure that we produced in English. And I very much look forward to the discussions that we'll have together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thank you very much. That was also really an enlightening presentation, and it connects very well to the first one where we had talked about or heard about the diets that are, or the practices that are different in Eastern Europe. And now we saw an example from Switzerland where Marlene and her colleagues looked with the social practice theory at what is happening and how can these practices be shifted towards a better diet with different types of prescriptions and recommendations, or with less maybe actually. So we keep going. The third presentation is by Mai Kobayashi, who is part of our team here at Feast, and she's gonna present about Love Thy Robber, exploring the informal food economy of unattended food stands. Thank you very much. I think that was also a brilliant presentation, and it takes us really nicely from the informal practices and the non-market conforming practices of Eastern Europe here to Japan, and it connects nicely with Switzerland, where the preference for local and seasonal food showed up in Marlene's research as well. And the food stands here in Japan and the informal systems do also feed into this notion of local and seasonal, with the additional benefit of being non-neoliberal. But as we can see, the system is out there and trying to co-opt ideas and integrate ideas into the mainstream market, and we'll see how things develop. I just posted the link to the map that we created, which Mai mentioned in the presentation, so you can have a look around at some other practices that are available in Japan. It's still the prototype map, it's not finished, so be patient with it, but please give us feedback on this, and please post questions to Mai as well as to all the other speakers in the According Slack channel. If you add the @ sign to the name, then the speaker will get a notification, and so that is a very efficient way of communicating in that space where more and more messages are coming in. The fourth presentation now will be by Balint Balash, and Balint's presentation is about the legumes' role in post-COVID-19 situation, reorienting the focus of policy on legume-based food and feed systems. Let's have a look.
Hello, my name is Balint Balázs from the Environmental Social Science Research Group, Hungary. And in this presentation, I would like to give an overview of our policy analysis, which has been done in a project called TRUE, which is standing for Transition Path to Sustainable Legume-Based Systems in Europe. And in the policy analysis that we performed, we'd like to concentrate on the most important insights about reorienting the focus of policies on legume-based food and feed systems.
Our main objective was to analyze and enable policies and regulatory systems for the promotion of legumes. This was divided into 4 subtasks. Task number 1 was to identify and characterize legume-friendly policies as well as main drivers for such policy change. Task number 2 was to host stakeholder workshops for new ideas and innovations for progressive governance solutions. Task number 3 was to provide stakeholders with new institutional and policy frameworks for the governance of legume-based farming systems and also consumption and production patterns. Finally, task number 4 was to raise awareness of the positive roles of legumes in the human diet and agricultural production. Our first report on the co-design of the policy analysis was submitted in the first reporting period. This report pointed out that the low profitability of legumes cannot be fully counterbalanced through the price support or economic incentives. It also pointed out that there is a need for novel socio-technical innovations where state and non-state actors can join to lead the transition towards more legume-based food systems. The report also showed that there needs to be an increase in farmers' knowledge in managing rotations and also using less mineral fertilizers. Also, there is a need to demonstrate ecological benefits of legumes as well as health and nutrition benefits of legumes. There is also a need to develop supply chain capacities and food innovations at the local and regional scale to create new outlets for legumes. Overall, this report is pointing out that there is a need for a more enabling policy environment, which is combining several instruments from the agricultural policies and also other policy domains, including, for example, the greening measures or investment in research and innovation, and also a ban on the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. After this scan of the previous reports and the already available literature on legume-based food innovation and policy development, we looked at different case studies in a report about the co-production of the policy assessment. Within this report, we used an interpretative policy framework that looked at the context of the policies, but also the content level of various legal documents and also the processes around the formulation of policies. On this background, we produced the evaluation of the European level policies and also looked at various policy case studies in 8 countries. These country studies highlighted various policy challenges and innovations at different points of the legume value chains. In the second report on the policy assessment, we came to the conclusions that for legume-focused innovation, the primary hindrance is actually the inconsistencies among policies. This incoherence on the policy landscape is exemplified by the following components. First, protein strategies, where they exist, are usually oriented towards industrial livestock production. Agricultural policy, including the Common Agricultural Policy, greening, and voluntary coupled schemes, is very effective, but not in general, only in different ways in different countries. Also, we found that despite the activity of the research and innovation sector regarding legumes, a lack of knowledge transfer becomes the common problem. Also, we contended that there are only very few governance solutions which are already there with a proven effect on increasing homegrown legume consumption. We also found that within consumer policies, health and nutrition are becoming the leading domains, and they are really gaining increasing acknowledgement. Despite this momentum, their focus is very far from legumes. Finally, we found that trade policy, as it exists now in the world, created mutual interdependencies, and in terms of legumes, the demand by China is leading the soy production and also the trading prices all over the world. So in the next step of our policy assessment, we've been trying to look at what's behind this low level of consumption and production of legumes in Europe. So we developed Delphi Questionnaire that was looking at favorable governance contexts to collate anonymous opinions from stakeholders. This Delphi Questionnaire run with a panel of geographically dispersed policy experts. Altogether, 80 expert panel members were assessing 10 food policy areas. These are the main components of what we call the legume paradox. And we asked them to develop favorable policies and transition pathways iteratively in this Delphi study. What we found in the first round is a complicated and interconnected web of the arguments behind the legume paradox. So, what does a Delphi entails as a research method? A Delphi contains usually 4 phases. Phase number 1 is that you have to create a panel and a query. Phase number 2 is that you have to build an expert panel relying on your stakeholders. Phase number 3 is executing the Delphi in several rounds, if possible. And phase number 4 is the analysis and then the reporting of the Delphi result. In the True project, we deployed a web-based Delphi through an open source software called edelphi.org. It is basically an interactive platform and a survey based on the activity of the participants and the broader user community. Here, experts have been invited in a personal email, and finally, altogether, 80 experts accepted our invitation to participate in this Delphi exercise. So, like with every research method, there is pros and cons. So what are the main benefits of the Delphi? For example, social dominance in a Delphi study is relatively easily avoided, as a much broader plurality of viewpoints can emerge. It is also a benefit that we can build in feedback loops into the process so that we enable really a learning journey for the participant stakeholders. And finally, we can also use and rely on statistical methods here while we are aggregating opinions. There are also challenges of a Delphi study. Challenge number 1 is subjectivity. So it means that our results often reflect the subjective view of the summarizing experts. Challenge number 2 is what we call confirmation bias. It is actually a tendency that we select the arguments according to the summarizing experts' preconceptions. And challenge number 3 is the actual interest. In general, it's quite usual that researchers' interests are overrepresented compared to other stakeholders. So we need to be always very careful to reflect on these challenges. Delphi as a methodology was also unique because it led us to relatively unexpected results. So for example, we started this with an open question. Why are legume production and consumption are so low in Europe? And our 80 experts are basically all referred to what is usually described as a system lock-in in the literature, which is that value chain actors are quite limited in the uptake of legumes. How it is illustrated? The best it is illustrated that they say, for example, that production is very low because legumes are not competitive enough compared to other crops due to the lack of demand. But at the same time, they also say that consumption is also low because legumes are not attractive enough compared to the meat or other food products due to the lack of innovative products. So this paradox within the legume paradox is a real system lock-in. How do experts see the actual intervention points in this locked-in situation? There are two types. One is improving the profitability of legume production. This can be done via increased policy support of legume production, for example, through payments for positive environmental externalities or higher taxes on inorganic fertilizers. Or, for example, increased policy support of legumes compared to imported protein crops. This could be done by requiring imported protein crops to meet the same environmental standards. Another intervention point to improve the profitability is to actually improve the advisory system to provide more information and practical knowledge to farmers on how to produce legumes more efficiently. And finally, the profitability could be improved through novel breeds, potentially building on traditional, local, adapted varieties, which meet requirements of reliable yield, plant health, and adaptability to climate change. Experts also see a number of ways to increase the demand for legume-based products. For example, via creating novel products, both feed and food, that meet consumer preferences. Processed food, which is tasty and easy and quick to prepare. But also branding legume-based products as trendy and healthy to improve the attractiveness of such products. The demand could be also increased by co-creating and sharing new knowledge about the benefits of legumes on human and planetary health with the consumers. And finally, it's also important to include legumes in dietary recommendations at all policy levels. During this Delphi study, we asked our experts to assess 10 statements related to what we called the legume paradox. And all of them are outlining different policy scenarios. The assessments went along two aspects, probability and impact. By probability, we meant to assess what is the probability that a certain policy leads to change in the legume production and consumption. And by impact, we meant what kind of impact a certain policy could have on legume production and consumption. Based on the results, we managed to differentiate three main clusters with regards to this probability and impact scores based on the assessment of the experts on the 10 specific policies. There are high potential policies with relatively high probability and impact scores. There are medium potential policies with medium probability and impact scores, and low potential policies with the lowest possible probability and impact. This Delphi study managed to identify 3 policy action areas and governance solutions with the highest potential to trigger change. Number 1 is the investment in agri-food and feed research and knowledge transfer that will increase the competitiveness of protein crops and legume-based food products. Number 2 is a ban on use of inorganic nitrogen fertilizer, which can create incentives for more legume production. And number 3 is diet and health and nutrition policies and public campaigns that could promote the inclusion of legumes in human diets and could make legumes much more visible and also probably increase imports for consumption. From these main insights on the favorable governance contexts, we generated a question. The question was actually, can we combine different policy instruments, for example, legal regulations or market-based incentives or product labeling, so that these combinations could add up to policy mixes? So in the second round of Delphi, we are now looking at how policy interactions and interdependencies can forge pathways towards legume-based food and feed systems in the coming 10 years. During this Delphi study, our experts also identified which are the policies with less potentialities. So we have here a cluster of policies with medium potentials. For example, here we have agricultural incentives within the Common Agriculture Policy that support farmers growing plant proteins. Also, with medium potential, experts believe there is the green direct payments within the CAP that actually helps the sustainability transition of the food and feed system. Similarly, climate change policies are there to help to reduce meat production and consumption, while at the same time increase legume cropping and decrease the emission from inorganic fertilizers. And finally, in this range of medium potential policies, experts identified public food procurement, which offers often more healthy options in food service markets and also help the shift towards legume-based diets. And also there are policies which, according to our experts, have very low potential to trigger change. Here we have the changing of the actual international trade agreements that would actually reduce EU's dependency on soybean imports. But we also have here all other policies that support legume production and consumption in Europe that actually also increases industrialized livestock production. And finally, we have here the provisioning of transparency of market data that would actually help to boost the legume supply chains. Experts believe that these policies have much less potentialities than the former ones. So, in the second round of the Delphi exercise, we ask our stakeholders to assess what would happen if certain policy instruments were introduced. How would that impact the sustainability of EU agriculture? How would that impact legume production and consumption in Europe? So, for example, we ask, imagine that by 2030, stricter environmental and climate regulations are applied on crop and livestock production in Europe. Imagine that the new measures combine legal restrictions on inorganic nitrogen use with a system of allowances for farmers. Or we ask their opinion about the abolition of the Common Agricultural Policy. Imagine that by 2030, a radical policy shift happens and therefore the EU stops all agricultural subsidies through the CAP. With this, I would like to invite every one of you to take part in forging these transition pathways together. So join us in this Delphi exercise. Write me and I will put you on the panel. And now let me introduce the most important transition path from my point of view. So for a sustainable food and feed value networks, we would require a much better integration of ecological health, nutrition aspects into the food and agriculture policies. Secondly, we would require public support for making the benefits, ecology, climate, health, nutrition, and so on, much more visible, and promote the production and consumption of more legumes through, for example, public food procurement. And number three, knowledge transfer and multi-actor collaborations, public-private partnerships that would enable a dynamic and much more harmonized mobilization of the value chain actors. Please get in contact with me if you want to be part of our Delphi panel. Thank you very much.
Okay. Huh, now I'm disappeared in the green screen. That's funny too. I'm talking from the off. Cool. Special effects today. So while my colleague Christoph is fixing me up here, we want to move on to the questions session. We're a bit behind time by about the length of a whole presentation. Nonetheless, so if possible, is Eli online? Eli Chabai, he had a question. Can you find him? Is he there? Maybe not. Okay.
Yes, I'm on. Sorry, it just took me a minute to find the unmute.
No worries. You want to go ahead with your question?
Sure. This was directed at Piotr early, the first talk, and I thought it was a wonderful talk and very interesting ideas in it, which to me resonated with the ideas of local identities. And, you know, we all know of the history, particularly during the Cold War and thereafter, with East Europe. And so my question in essence is whether or not some of that national identity and perhaps also a certain bias because of that history against the West, in a sense, supports and helps maintain this localization of the food economy, which also in that sense means that the drive to lose that because of economic progression may not be there in that case, as opposed to the West. And I just would be very interested in hearing Piotr's comments or thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Okay, can I start responding?
Thank you. Go ahead, Peter.
Oh, hello. Thank you, Ilan, for this question. And I was reading it earlier and I was thinking about it. And I would say that there is a case which would confirm your hypothesis, but it's a different one. It's the origin of farmers' markets in several East European countries maybe 10 years ago, which was a response to the discovery of mediocre food marketed to East European consumers by Western supermarket chains, you know, the same chains in Germany, Austria, selling food under the same brand, sometimes even at higher prices, but tests revealed that the food was of mediocre quality compared to the same food sold in the same supermarket in the West. So that led to a major outrage, as you can imagine. And one response was to set up farmers' markets in cities, selling something which was considered to be food of higher quality than the one sold in the supermarkets. And I would associate this with some sort of kind of backlash against, you know, this westernization of Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. However, when we talk about informal food economy, I was talking about in my presentation, I don't necessarily think this would associate with national identities and so on. I don't think this is a reason for this. What I see as, there's a multiplicity of reasons why people are involved, and we have written extensively about that. But what I would like to highlight today is the kind of maintenance of the link between rural and urban environment. Even people who live in urban environments in many countries in Eastern Europe still maintain strong links to the rural identities, rural lifestyles, and food, of course, is an important part of this identity. So I think this is one of the reasons why this informal economy is quite strong. There are many other reasons, but I think this is one of the very important ones. Of course, food quality and health are clearly the main motivations for people being involved in these practices.
Thank you. That sort of gives me a different hypothesis around the narratives that drive this. That's very helpful. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. There were some more questions to Petra, and maybe it's possible to answer those ones then online in the Slack, as we want to split the time a bit evenly between the different speakers. So I would like to move on to the question for Marlene, and I think one has been answered already, the question by Greg. So there was another one by Stephen, actually. Stephen, do you want to ask the question to Marlene?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for the very excellent presentation, Marlene. My question was one that we had discussed a little bit yesterday with Kanang's presentation on practice-oriented policy development in Bangkok. And as the question, I mean, you've read it and sort of answered it in a way where it seems as if this food policy forum was something that came out of the project. I'd like to know, I guess, a little bit more about the forum, and then how, and as you mentioned, these practices are so intertwined into different elements of society. And if you look at governance structures, they're only looking at certain silos, or they're very departmentalized. And so within your forum, are there ways in which, is it getting the right kind of governmental actors together in the same room to sort of coordinate their policies, or is it, is there any insights essentially into how, you can make those processes work better so you have policies that actually, affect practice at the social level?
Yes, thank you so much, Stephen. I wanted to say I enjoyed all of the presentations this morning here in Geneva. Thank you all so much. Really interesting stuff. Very interesting links also to be made between them. Yes, so, part of what I was trying to explain with the presentation is that the way you frame a problem is obviously going to lead to certain solutions, right? So if you frame problems as individual change, then you're going to look for solutions that try to influence individual behavior and decision making. And that's very different from a practice-based approach. When you look at practices such as provisioning for food, preparing a meal, sharing a meal, you definitely realize that the policy arena is way too sectoral and siloed to address them, and different actors and different forms of expertise need to come together. So perhaps, we made the suggestion that a food forum is necessary. I've seen that such forums have emerged in other contexts and do exist. Now our next phase here in Switzerland is to work at the state level to engage people in thinking already in a practice-based perspective. And for that, we're using change points, which is an approach to social change that has been developed by colleagues at the University of Manchester based on social practice theory. So I'll put it in the Slack chat. I think it's a really interesting way of sort of applying the practice theory approach to think about where interventions need to take place. And in doing so, obviously recognizing that different kinds of actors need to be brought together. So yeah, practice theory is always more complex than the silver bullet solution of let's have an information campaign and change behavior.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thanks for the reply and thanks for the question. Then the next one, we had Mai presenting about the informal food stands. And there was a question by Rajat. Rajat, are you there?
Hi.
Hey.
Yeah.
Hey, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. So my question is both to Peter and Mai. This is about food practices that they mentioned. Is there any connection between these and major historical political events? Because Mai's presentation, she already mentioned that these unattended food stalls sprung up after the war. And maybe in Czechoslovakia, in Czechia also, there might be some political upheaval or something where from these new practices began to develop. I'm just wondering if there is any such connection between major historical political events and these informal practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajat, for your question. I really appreciated your question. It made me think as well, and I was trying to think of a connection, and I think there are many connections. I think one, first of all, in terms of when unattended food stalls or stands, I kept on going between stand and stall. There's no correct term. There's not a good understanding of when they generally started, but from what I can tell, they are more of a modern phenomenon. And so when we say post-war, that coincides with a lot of modernization in the food system and the modernization of ways in which people shop. And so it needs to correspond with people going out of their houses to shop on a daily basis, as opposed to how people shopped before, which from historical accounts were quite different. And also it needs to coincide theoretically with the kind of the stability of society. So those are two important factors for unattended food stands. But I think it also, when you're talking about disturbances, I think for the war, post-war in Japan, and also the COVID-19 situation that we're in, it's often the urban areas that are more precarious or at risk, and the rural areas seem to have more stability when it comes to access to food. And so that, I think, kind of translates into maybe diversification of practices, and that's kind of what I kind of came up with, but I'm sure there's a lot to explore there. And
okay, thank you. Thank you
very much.
Okay.
Because time is advancing, it's that's always the problem. If you talk about interesting things, time is always advancing. But at least we have the Slack, so I again would ask to keep up the conversation there, even if you couldn't be answered live. So I think next one, Balint, is online as well. Yay! Even though your image says Stephen McGreevy, that's a kind of sneaky way, but we found you. So there was one
I just changed it. I realized.
And a new haircut from last time. New haircut, no name. Perfect. You pretend to be a Westerner now to be accepted in academia, I guess. To overcome the bias against Eastern Central Europe. So Tamura-san, why don't you go ahead with your question?
Hello, my name is Nurieta Mullah from Lim. I I have a question that how much the people link up with the discussion about the negative effect of the inorganic fertilizer with the encouraging the legume production and consumption. Especially in Japan, the phosphorus is the main source to affect the coastal ecosystem. So it might be one angle to encourage the legume production and consumption. So I would like to hear from your case. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, indeed, this is a very relevant point because preventing the use of inorganic nitrogen fertilizer has been regarded by most of the stakeholders, especially in Europe, in our study as the highest potential policy area. So basically, overall restrictions on nitrogen fertilizers will create definitely positive impact for the production of legumes basically everywhere, and this is regarded and this is more and more acknowledged by most of the stakeholders. But actually the impact on the consumption, what is also very much necessary to consider, this is quite uncertain, this impact. Basically the inclusion of legumes or other nitrogen fixing crops into the rotations and let's say to any agricultural systems, production systems, even grass mixes for feed. That's a typical management practice that would replace the fertilizers by actually replacing it with the legumes. But simply just to regulate the fertilizer use is probably not enough to make a shift towards a more, let's say, increased production of the legumes. So there is a mix of policies that is needed. And basically what we say in an article that is coming out of this Delphi exercise is that regulating fertilizer use could be an absolutely positive incentive for the transition. But actually, we have already in Europe many processes, for example, national protein strategies, and we see that it is only delivered over a long term, let's say in a 10 years time period, which is making it very difficult, very difficult for the farmers. So just to cut it short, I can say that the prevention of inorganic nitrogen would actually produce a drastic change in farmers' behavior. They would probably produce much more legumes, but making such a shift is absolutely questioned from all other stakeholders, including the farmers. So this remains only mostly in researchers' minds, I would say. And it also might have a very negative effect on other crop productions, and especially in Europe, this is cereals, actually decreasing the domestic yields and increasing the prices of other grains. That would definitely cause a crisis in the EU agriculture. So it would be also very difficult to impose any monitoring system of such a restriction, and this has been also quite often flagged by Hungarian, not just Hungarian, but also EU policymakers and different stakeholders.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you very much for the detailed reply and the nice question. So there is more questions in the Slack, and that's okay. We're going to leave them there for now. We are coming to the end of this session. We had 4 presentations. that took us to the alternatives that exist already nowadays. They are practiced, they are out there, and they can be researched. The presentation's shown that we need to shift the focus of research, but also of policy making. And there needs to be a raise of awareness in the public. People need support for these practices, and research and policy can deliver this support as well. I want to thank all the presenters for preparing the presentations, but also being available live now, and also being available in the Slack. I hope you can stay with us throughout the day. We're going to have really more interesting presentations coming up after the break. It's going to be Kentaro live from his truck delivering vegetables, and Ashlisha live from her farm or from a farm. And we're going to have Chris from the UK, probably also from his farm. So stay around and get up, move, get the system going, get some drinks and fresh air, and then hopefully I'll see you back here in 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Thank you very much. See you later.
Okay, I think I want to start according to plan. We're in Japan here, so we always start exactly on time. Welcome to the practitioner roundtable. This morning on the way to work, I was wondering why it's called a practitioner and sort of what we're talking about when we use the term practitioner. It probably partly means not a full-time researcher or something of the kind, but Max just now actually defined it for me, namely, it means people who are broadcasting live or otherwise from farms. Maybe I should have stayed at home and stood in our little vegetable plot behind the house, but it's too cold to do that here in Kyoto right now. So welcome to the Practitioner Roundtable. We have 3 speakers here from Japan, India, and the UK. And without any sort of taking more time than is due to me, I'm going to invite Suzuki Kentaro to start his presentation. Please fire away.
From Kyoto Organic Action, and I'm really honored to be speaking in such a symposium. It's my first time speaking in an event like this. So I will tell you a little story about how I ended up starting this movement called Kyoto Organic Action. I used to live in Kyoto City, and we moved to the countryside in 2010. We're about an hour's drive northwest from Kyoto City, in a place called Nantan in middle Kyoto Prefecture. I started a little garden for myself when we moved, and that's where my life started to change a lot. The mere process of planting seed in the soil and taking care of the plants and sharing the harvest with families and friends is just so rich and inspiring. But on the other hand, I noticed that the country life wasn't all just good and easy. The village communities were facing so many problems, like depopulation. Young people were moving more and more out to the cities, and the farmlands and forests are getting abandoned. Wildlife damage to the crops is getting worse every year, and the reality in the villages were quite depressing. But at the same time, I was meeting many young, new, willing farmers moving in from the cities to the countryside to do organic agriculture. And I just thought that these new farmers had so much to offer to the local communities. So I started a mobile vegetable shop in 2014, aiming to help these new farmers make a living out of organic farming, which is considered very difficult in Japan. Now I do deliveries to about 60 families and about 10 restaurants every week. And basically, this is what I do for a living. This is what it looks like. But while I was working on this business, I noticed more problems, this time within the whole agricultural system and the supply chain itself. The shipping fees were getting very high, and organic farmers didn't have enough connections with local markets. But on the other hand, consumers in the cities had very few access to local organic vegetables. The supermarkets in Japan sell very few, if any, organic produce, and we don't have many farmers markets in Japan in the first place. There seemed to be a lack of social structure to support the local organic agriculture, a lack of connection and collaboration amongst those people who had similar interests. And so, aiming to connect local organic farmers to each other and to the local vegetable shops and restaurants, I suddenly came up with a meetup event in the spring of 2017. This event turned out to be quite a sensation. The first one, 70 people participated, farmers, grocers, chefs, and others. And everybody had so much to tell, so much to share, and it just went all night. And this was the start of Kyoto Organic Action. Now, after the event, I came up with an idea to streamline the distribution of local organic produce. The idea was to run a truck collecting the vegetables from local organic farmers and distributing it to the vegetable shops in Kyoto City. A transportation line shared by the local organic community. The plan was to collect the vegetables along the Kyoto-Jukan Highway, which runs from Kyoto City to the northern tip of Kyoto Prefecture, about 100 kilometers. At first, we designated collecting stations in each area with the help of farmers and shop owners, so that the collecting could be done efficiently. Farmers would bring in their vegetables at a given time every week to these stations, and we would collect the vegetables along the way. We also made an online ordering system using Google Spreadsheet, where multiple orders from multiple vegetable shops can be sorted out and be sent to the farmers through email. This ordering system improved dramatically when one of our member companies offered to customize their system called Informal, which was originally designed and funded by the Ministry of Agriculture as an online platform for organic farmers and grocers and restaurants to get connected. Very soon, more and more farmers and grocers became interested, and our community grew quite rapidly. This resulted directly to the increase of load, and the vehicle became bigger along with it. Now we run this truck 4 times a week, collecting from about 30 farmers and distributing to about 12 shops and companies. On the other hand, in 2018, we established the Kyoto Organic Action Council to discuss matters related to organic agriculture and its local distribution. We have held many events like farm visits, technical workshops, management seminars, business meetings, and so on. Our aim is to enhance the overall production and distribution of organic produce in Kyoto and to improve the social environment for the farmers and the local communities. Our members are mainly farmers and vegetable shop owners, but we also welcome people with other professions as well. We've held baseball games as well. We tend to like baseball a lot, and usually we play with the farmer teams versus the shop teams. And yeah, we have a lot of fun. And we also made this map of the shops in Kyoto City where you can buy local organic vegetables. And this year, we are planning to launch a Buy Local, Eat Organic campaign to reach out to the ordinary consumers in Kyoto City. We haven't done much promotion yet, and this is our first real campaign that we want to do from this spring, I hope. Now, our goal is to establish a local sustainable food and agriculture network, an organic community with different professions, not just farmers, but shop owners, restaurants, cafes, and ordinary consumers. We are still no more than a collective of willing farmers and shop owners. And our current issues are, one is of self-governance, how to maintain a constructive community. Focusing on the big picture, but discussing details related to the actual production and business can become very challenging sometimes, especially when it involves both farmers and buyers. And the other issue is of promotion, how to get the ordinary consumers more interested in the connection behind what they buy and eat. Again, the connection between the big picture of sustainability and the small picture of daily life. I'm really interested in the different contexts, in different social backgrounds, and how people are trying to overcome this challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kentaro. We'll get back to you in the discussion time afterwards, but I really liked the emphasis on having the big and the small picture at the same time. Linking these two levels, I think, is key to a lot of things in this conference. So I'm going to invite Ashlisha Katze to make her presentation. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ashlesha and I'm from Amrita Bhumi, which is an agroecology training center located in the southern Indian state of Karnataka. This is a center where we carry out trainings on agroecology for youth, for women and for men, and it is linked to the global peasant movement, La Via Campesina. Now, Amrit Bhumi is involved in a number of alternatives. For example, it's part of an agroecology movement, and ever since COVID, it has also set up a direct marketing effort between agroecology farmers and urban consumers. But very interestingly, one very important alternative that I want to highlight in this presentation is that of women's collective farming. And through this presentation, I really hope to highlight the question of gender justice in this very important conversation about food alternatives. The majority of the work in agriculture in our country is done by women. About 80% of farm work is done by women, yet women own under 10% of land. And because women don't own land, because women are landless, they're not considered to be farmers in the conventional sense. They are mostly agricultural laborers. Because they don't own land, they don't have access to entitlements, they don't have access to state support, such as extension, such as marketing, such as subsidies. And there's also a gender wage differential. So the situation of women farmers, women in general in agriculture, is one where they are at a marginalized position. So I'd like to begin this presentation by this very provocative quote by feminist activists who say, if modernization transformed agricultural gender relations and removed women from decision-making, then one might ask how alternatives, like agroecology, are creating more power for women. And yes, this is a very important question, and oftentimes we find that there are excellent alternatives out there, but they might not be engaging with this very important question of gender and how to ensure that the benefits of agroecology reach everybody and empower the most marginalized. So this is a group of women. In the image you can see about 14 women. All of them are landless women. They come from what we call the historically oppressed castes in India. and these are castes that have been denied access to land. They have always worked as landless laborers. Many of these women are old, they are uneducated, they are single. By single, I mean that they are divorced or abandoned or widowed, and they're responsible as single women for their household. And so there's a lot of intersectionality at play here. We can see that, their caste, their gender, their education, their single status, all of these together define their marginal position in India's agrarian society. Now, these women worked as daily wage laborers, but they lost their jobs during COVID, like many other rural laborers. And so this was an opportunity where activists at Amrita Bhumi thought, why not initiate this experiment where women, particularly landless women, access a piece of land and cultivate it collectively and learn how to engage in collective farming. So this is how this project started. The first problem that this group faced was how to access land. And the second problem that they faced is how to conduct the farming and how to access the know-how around agroecological farming. So we were fortunate that Amrit Bhumi had additional land that they were able to lease out at a very favorable and non-extractive rate to this women's group. And the feminist activists at Amrita Bhumi have been providing a lot of day-to-day hand-holding support. I think this is one of the key lessons that we are drawing now, is that women cannot automatically start farming just because they have land. They need support in terms of seed saving, pesticides, management, understanding the agroecological processes at their farm. So all this day-to-day farmer training is conducted through other farmers and through technicians. The group is sharing their profits, and they are also taking back the food that they produce for their own household security. They are also getting paid a daily wage. Because this is a project is at its initial stages, they don't have the level of production at the moment that is going to yield profits for them. A wage is paid to them so that they are able to sustain their work over a longer run, and then when they become independent, the hope is that they will be generating enough food or enough profit to be able to become at least partially independent. Approaches for agriculture, particularly for women, bring a lot of benefits. This is what the experience is showing us in India. The first is, the group is able to pool their resources, they're able to pool their labor, they're able to share resources. So there can be a case where one woman in the group has land, but she's not able to cultivate it by herself. And she might not have the capital, and so she might offer the land to the group, and the rest of the group will join in, and they might share their produce with the lady who owns the land. There's also a building of social cohesion, there's solidarity, there's group work, there's group support, and this has been creating a lot of meaningful work for the women as well, because they are now working for themselves. They are working for their own household security, for their own economic empowerment, and also the group work increases their bargaining power when it comes to marketing or in other, including with the government. These groups are also safe spaces for women. Oftentimes women might not feel comfortable in mixed gender spaces. They might feel marginalized. They might not have a voice in these groups, but when they work in a women-only group, they tend to be they feel much more safer to be able to express themselves and share their opinions and their hopes and dreams. While women's collective farming is at a very nascent stage in Amrita Bhumi and in the state of Karnataka where we are located, it has already attained massive scale in our neighboring state of Kerala. And this is because the state has played a very proactive role in supporting women's collectives, particularly around joint farming. The state provides a number of support mechanisms to the women. If women form a group, then they assist the women, local government will assist the women to find land. They could be provided with state land, or they can play a mediator between landlords and the women's groups. In other states, such as Karnataka, it's a very big problem. Usually the landlords, the landowners are the ones who don't want to loan their land to women because they're not sure that they will be able to pay them on time, or they might harass them. This is not the case in Kerala, where the state is backing this process. At the same time, the state provides a lot of incentives, particularly if the production process is agroecological in nature. So they'll provide subsidies, loans are also provided. Even if the land lease is informal in nature, the banks in Kerala recognize this and they offer loans and credit. Aside from this, local governments are also helping the women with extension, with marketing. So in conclusion, I'd just like to reiterate 2 or 3 key takeaways from this presentation. The first is that food alternatives like agroecology, they must think about social justice aims and how they are improving the conditions for the most marginalized groups, such as women in our case, and particularly those women who are even more disadvantaged, such as single women or older women or women from particular classes and castes. Secondly, the Indian experience is showing us that collective approaches for women have proven to be very beneficial as they help them to access land, to build solidarity, to build their confidence, to improve their bargaining position vis-a-vis markets or landlords or even the government, and many other benefits. But this is not an easy process, and the women have faced a lot of resistance and impediments. Oftentimes, the impediments come from landlords or also from their own families and communities who have very patriarchal attitudes. And finally, such efforts require that social movements and NGOs play a supportive and hand-holding role, at least for the initial stages, and even more importantly, that the state must play a proactive role in order for such approaches to really succeed in the long run.
All right, thank you very much. This sounded to me partly that there's an additional big picture that needs to be taken into account, that one of, well, justice in general and gender justice more specifically. We're going to move to the third presentation. Chris Smage, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Chris Smage, a small-scale farmer and writer in southwest England, and I'm going to talk a bit about transitioning food cultures in contemporary Britain, England in particular. The background to this is quite unpromising, in all honesty. Britain industrialised early, and it has a very urbanised population with little connection to farming or local food cultures. Average farm size is among the highest in Europe, and the relative prices of fossil energy, labour and land or housing push us towards highly mechanised farming, geared mostly to producing cereal and meat as cheaply as possible. A large proportion of our fruit and veg is imported, and even then we eat less of it than we should for a healthy diet. So we're booked a long way into what I call the arable corner of over-reliance on a handful of field crops rich in simple macronutrients. The agricultural subsidy regimen under the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy exacerbated all these trends. But as we exit from the EU and the regimen is withdrawn before the wider trade landscape is clear, it seems likely there'll be a further depressing effect on the agricultural sector and its ageing workforce. Against the background of all that doom and gloom, of course, there are some wider miseries to worry about: the effects of climate change, the pandemic, and the necessary end of a global economic growth society. And we pretty much know that human well-being and Earth systems well-being in those contexts are best served by focusing economic activity on low-carbon, labour-intensive sectors, among which agriculture and especially horticulture surely loom the largest. And we pretty much know that the best way to develop this in agriculture is through small, mixed, basically organic or agroecological farms and gardens, especially where we break down entrenched distinctions between forestry, agriculture, and horticulture, and between commercial and non-commercial production. I started doing that kind of farming myself nearly 20 years ago for that reason, and since then I've looked with interest at debates within the sector about different farming methods, tillage and min-tillage, regenerative agriculture, green manuring, perennial cropping, livestock issues and so forth. But eventually I came to a kind of relaxed view of it that, given the chance, people will experiment with all sorts of different farming ideas, and eventually they'll figure out forms of renewable agriculture that make sense for them locally, which I think will generally look quite similar to the local low-energy mixed agricultures predating modern times. The real problem is that people aren't given the chance to do this within the present socio-economic system. So then my attention shifted to the sorts of policies, the politics and the economics that currently are obstructing these kinds of agriculture and that could alternatively be promoting them. It's not too hard to identify such policies. The problem is that we need a fundamentally different underlying culture for those policies to get traction as a plausible political programme. So my main interest now is in describing that underlying culture and identifying possible sources of change to make it mainstream. In a British context, I'd identify 7 possible sources of change. First, many young people are increasingly alienated from the high housing costs, low pay and low job security world of mainstream work, and increasingly drawn to food and farming issues via environmental concerns and activism. I think there's a deep reservoir of enthusiasm for change among the young that will make itself heard in the coming years. Second, and relatedly, there's an emerging landscape of activist organisations aiming to change the food and farming sector towards more localist and agroecological ends, such as the Land Workers Alliance, which is associated with the international peasant group La Via Campesina, the Ecological Land Co-op, and various other groups emerging in Britain and in England, for example, from the transition towns and Extinction Rebellion movements. Third, there's the beginnings of a political movement around land reform and deconcentration of land ownership. This has been pioneered in Scotland with political devolution against the backdrop of the country's extreme inequalities in land ownership, leading to new legislation around community rights to buy, and in Wales with the Future Generations Act and innovations in planning policy geared to self-reliant smallholding. England is much more conservative and far behind that curve, but there are the first glimmerings of a movement for land reform here too, as represented by books like Guy Shrubsole's Who Owns England? Fourth, relatedly, but at a slightly more fine-grained level, one of the obstacles to spreading agroecological practices is that it's typically labour-intensive but low income, and planning or zoning regulations geared to capital-intensive farming and a depopulated countryside have made it hard in recent times for people to live on small rural holdings and develop their enterprises. My feeling is that this is beginning to change to some degree through more open-minded official attitudes, but also through people pushing at the boundaries of the system a little more actively. At the same time, there's a danger that loosening the regulatory framework around rural land use opens up the countryside to purely residential and other non-agricultural developments, which could have negative consequences. Fifth, many people across the country exhibit a slightly subversive appreciation for small local businesses as underdogs and can be quite willing to support them beyond purely self-interested, rational economic calculation. For example, we used to sell vegetables out of the back of our van, parked up briefly in side streets in our local town, which we advertised ahead of time on Facebook. And we did quite good business, in part because customers enjoyed the somewhat clandestine, below the radar nature of it. And on small scales, I think there's a lot of potential for finding ways of tapping local markets like that. Sixth, the chronic national underproduction of fresh fruit and vegetables seems likely to promote future price hikes and even perhaps empty shelves in the shops, further exacerbated by the consequences of Brexit and the pandemic. And this will likely lead to more amateur domestic production, community or allotment gardening, guerrilla gardening, small-scale local commercial startups, and probably more important than any of that, a national conversation about accessing fresh and healthy whole foods. Seventh, building on that, the pandemic has exposed reliance on long food chains as supermarket shelves emptied of many lines, especially fresh fruit and veg. Local suppliers such as ourselves suddenly found themselves inundated with new customers. So the time is right for a national conversation about local food self-reliance. But as with Brexit, there's a danger these supply issues will be co-opted by narratives of corporate agri-nationalism, so we need to turn them to a more inclusive agroecological flavour. So in summary, there are reasons to be hopeful that new bioregional and agroecological food cultures may emerge in Britain. But at the moment, we're barely in the foothills, and there are many false trails, which is why I called this talk Climbing Mount Improbable. In my book, A Small Farm Future, I describe the likely occurrence of systemic crisis, not only in the food system, but in the whole global social, political, and economic system as a result of climate, energy, and economic shocks. And with some regret, I think it's in response to these much larger systemic crises that more renewable and localized food systems are eventually likely to emerge. The potential for bad outcomes in that is high, but nevertheless, I think it might prove possible, even in Britain, to build out from the kinds of things I've been talking about towards more positive forms of post-growth food localism.
Thank you, Chris. Excellent sticking to time on all three speakers. I think we had another big picture reminder in a way in the form of this list of I think 7 or 8 factors that may be sort of pointing towards a somewhat more conducive environment for agroecology in the UK. I'm going to first give the audience a chance to raise some of the questions that they have written down in Slack. I believe we have all 3 speakers on Zoom, so hopefully you'll be able to respond. And I'll take them in the order of the speakers. So for Suzuki-san, there were 2 questions. I'm going to see if Anim Week is available to ask his question. Anim, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Can you restate or sort of briefly raise the main point?
Sure. Let me just quickly catch up on commenting on a couple of different things here. So yeah, so that was a comment / question to Kentaro. Really enjoyed the presentation, very inspiring. Great work you're doing there. I was wondering whether, regarding the self-governance issue of this emerging kind of hyper-local food economy / system, whether regarding self-governance, you have looked into the diverse cooperative business models that are out there, producers cooperatives, multi-stakeholder cooperatives. We have created Sun Produce Cooperative in Arizona to support the distribution of organic produce, and that is really a cooperative of organic farmers to advance their distribution and consumer relationships. And I was wondering whether you have started to look into maybe some of these models and whether these are maybe conducive forms to support your self-governance efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Suzuki-san, are you there? There's a question about cooperative business models.
Hello.
Ah, there you are. Thank you.
Am I in?
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for the question, Anim. I have, me and, okay. I have talked a lot with the members at RIHN for the past few years, and they've been giving me a lot of examples of cooperatives and alternative food networks that exist around the world. And I personally look really close into a CSA model in Colorado called the Southwest Farm Fresh. It seems to be like a company run by 10 farmers, and well, basically our model at KOA comes from there. The first idea came from there, and they applied for government subsidies to buy a truck, and they collected their own vegetables by themselves and distributing it to the nearby towns. And what we're doing is basically the same, but what's different is that we have both farmers and shop owners and in the group, and the logic's kind of sometimes we kind of oppose each other in some decisions, and it kind of gets really difficult sometimes to keep a balance and to govern ourselves. And we also have a CSA program company in Japan called Anzen Nosan. They've been doing this for like 45 years. And they have a NPO where they talk about sustainability, how to streamline their own vegetables in their community. And they have a company that was made by the NPO that actually runs the business within their members. But in their case, they've been doing this for 40 years and their system has not been updated. And the system is really very inconvenient for modern people. And the farmers and the members are getting really old in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And yeah, their example has a lot of lessons for us to learn from. And yeah, I'm really looking for a new way to do this. So yeah, if anybody has has any ideas, please give me ideas. Thank you.
Sure, will do. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzuki-san. From your truck.
Yeah, from my truck.
I see that you actually parked your truck and weren't driving while trying to answer difficult questions.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the second presentation, Ashlisha's presentation, and there's two questions. I'm going to ask Mai Kobayashi if she can repeat her question verbally. Please go ahead, Mai, if you're there.
Yes, I'm here. I'm trying to, let's see. I was wondering, you were describing a lot of resistance to the activities that you were talking about, and I could imagine them, but I was also wondering how the preferences of the consumers might be reacting to the project or the products that you're providing. If the consumers are also open or interested in purchasing more agroecological and socially just products, and if so, why? So yeah, because I think a lot of the challenges that Kentaro was describing was also kind of promotion based, or of making the consumers more interested in agroecological products, which is a little bit different, say, than maybe the US or European countries. So I was just wondering about the consumer side, their preferences.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's very important. Overall, I think in India, there is a very big growth of what is the organic sector, but this awareness about who is producing is not really that prevalent. So we see a lot of corporates who are now controlling the organic sector and the organic label. And there's a very big piece missing, which is about the consumer education part that Kentaro was also talking about. And at least from our experience here, this has taken some time about, during COVID, the interface of where the producers were meeting the consumers personally, that played a very big role in the education piece. Also, the women collective here, they started to carry their produce every day to their villages. And they said initially there was not much interest, but now the people in the village, they wait for the women in the evening to buy their vegetables, and they talk to each other. There's this discussion, what are you doing, and so this kind of space of conversation and direct interaction has played a very big role. That at least that's what we're seeing in educating consumers and making them aware of how they're also participating in a system that is more just and also supporting landless women from their own communities.
Great.
Thank
you.
I'm not sure if I have understood all three speakers correctly, but it sounds as though the agroecological farmers are mostly people who are new entrant farmers. That may not be correct, but we have a question on Slack to Chris from Chika Kondo, which is along these lines. Chika, if you're there, can you briefly recapitulate your question? You've raised your hand. Does that mean?
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, there you are. Go ahead.
Hi, hi, Chris. Thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed listening to how farmers in the UK are kind of dealing with, it's really this idea of rural depopulation and creating a viable livelihood for farmers. I do a lot of field work in Japan with new entrant farmers, and a constant struggle a lot of these new entrant farmers face is how to set up a model of farming that they'd be able to kind of pass down to the next generation, because they are really overworking themselves and have difficulty actually accessing their markets that live out their values as agroecological farmers. So thinking about local consumption, but the rural areas are declining. But on the flip side, actually, for Japanese farmers, there are many direct markets, local direct markets that they can distribute to. And many times, a lot of older populations, so retired senior citizens also sell to these direct markets, and they, because they live off pensions, are able to really sell their produce at very, very, very affordable prices, almost to the point of most new entrant farmers cannot compete with such prices because it doesn't give a viable livelihood. And so a discussion I had with someone the other day was around, well, if the rural population declines, then these areas will not have these older grandmas and grandpas selling into the market, so they might be in a prime position to take up most of the market. But I was just wondering, in the UK, like how do farmers deal with these issues of rural depopulation, agroecological farming, and viable livelihoods as farmers?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, great questions. I mean, it sounds like the situation here is a bit different in that, you know, there isn't an older generation of farmers engaged in kind of smaller scale horticultural or agroecological practice. You know, there is a sort of existing large scale farm community, very few of whom really are moving into more local agroecological practice. You know, there's a move towards more nature-friendly farming in the kind of mainstream farm sector, but that's slightly different. I mean, the problem is really, you know, rural land in the UK is very high price. You know, it tends to be, you know, both farmland, but also, you know, it's kind of a high value residential kind of situation. So that, you know, one big problem that people have, you know, new entrant young farmers, is just being able to access affordable land. And, you know, there are models. I suppose my talk was very much a kind of sort of high level overview of the difficulties, because I think, you know, there are interesting things going on, and, you know, similar to some of the things we've been hearing about CSA schemes and so on, there's an organization called the Ecological Land Co-op that I'm involved with that tries to buy land and make it available on a sort of on an affordable basis for new entrant farmers, and to sort of cap the asset value, so that, you know, the big problem is kind of speculative increase in value. And yeah, so people are being quite inventive, and you know, there's the Open Food Network, food hubs, and so on. You know, there's the difficulty of these things sort of getting co-opted by larger scale players, and of sort of opening up the market, but you know, because still sort of 90% of grocery purchases in the UK pretty much are, you know, are in the big supermarkets. But yeah, it is difficult opening up that rural space at the moment. I mean, I think Brexit over the next couple of years maybe is going to change the playing field a bit, and people are typically sort of trying to find small bits of land, you know, sort of bare land that's at a relatively lower price, but you then get involved in the whole kind of planning battle over permission to be living in the countryside, which is kind of something that we went through over the years. So it is, you know, there is a sort of huge set of obstacles there that, you know, people are sort of trying to find their way around in various ways and beginning to make some sort of connections. You know, there's the beginning of a sort of movement that I mentioned with new organizations like the Land Workers Alliance that's beginning to act as a kind of union for small-scale agroecological farmers, but it's kind of against that bigger background of, you know, high rural land prices and a sort of very mainstream large-scale farming sector, which is, you know, the big obstacle.
Thank you very much. I'm going to, there's some more questions on Slack that we may go to in a little while, but I wanted to briefly touch upon the theme of Ashlisha's presentation, which is the question whether agroecology is creating more power for women. And I'm wondering whether Chris and Suzuki-san can reflect on this from their perspective. In the example we have from India, there's a specific effort that focuses on women. I don't think the two cases we've heard from the UK and Japan are specifically doing this, but what sort of are the gender implications of this new agriculture? Suzuki-san, are you still in a position to speak?
Yep. Yes, I'm here.
So in Kameoka, etc., how are these gender roles playing out in your work or the work that you know through KAO?
You know, the situation in Japan is quite different, I think, from India. One is because, you know, in Japan, all the discrimination and injustice, social injustice is kind of hidden behind, I don't know, mass media or whatever. But there's the term I liked about that Ashlisha used that I liked a lot is one about meaningful work. In Japan, people are really getting really tired of, you know, low-wage jobs and unofficial employment, and I think agroecological farming techniques and, you know, just the, you know, farming in the countryside, you know, as for my case as well, I found meaningful work there, you know, and I think that's one role that agroecology has, agroecological farming can, has a lot of possibilities in socially, I think. Does that answer a question?
Well, I don't think there's a correct or a wrong answer here, but
okay.
It's an important, meaningful work, I think, is a key word that clearly resonates. Chris, how about the UK?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think there is, you know, I suppose the traditional large-scale farm sector is sort of somewhat patriarchal. You know, there's the sort of stereotypical image of the farmer is a man in a big tractor, sort of, you know, doing mechanical things in a big field. I mean, I think that's definitely the sort of new entrant agroecological farmers. You know, partly it's a generational thing, I think, but also that horticulture, you know, sort of fruit and veg and perhaps smaller scale livestock farming seems to be more gender neutral, and you know, a lot of women getting involved in that. The Land Workers Alliance, which is emerging as a significant organisation pushing for a smaller scale agroecology, partly, well, yeah, I mean, for various reasons, but certainly one reason, because it's associated with La Via Campesina, which puts a strong emphasis on female participation and female leadership roles. You know, I think there's a lot more of a female presence within it. There isn't really anything quite like what we were hearing about in India. You know, sort of farming tends to still be quite sort of individual household based. I mean, there are kind of various women's farming events and things happening, but at that level of farm organization, not so much. But, you know, definitely, I think a much more, much more female participation now in the kind of emerging farming than was the, you know, the case with the kind of stereotypical farming of old with the farmer and kind of the farmer's wife sort of stereotype. So, you know, definitely some positive changes there.
All right, thank you very much. Ashlisha was saying that she lost her internet is back again. Ashlisha, we were talking about the gender dimension that you introduced in your talk, and I asked the two others to sort of reflect on this perspective from their various backgrounds. There's a somewhat related question from Stephen about Kerala. Stephen, are you there and can you ask your question?
Yes, I think so. You can hear me great. Yes, thank you very much for the presentations from everyone. Ashlisha, my question was something in your presentation. You mentioned that Kerala, I'm pronouncing it right, Kerala?
Yes.
Was having a kind of more developed support system for these sort of cooperatives, and I wondered why that was compared to other places. And I was just in the process of writing just another quick question about this idea of meaningful work. And you mentioned in your presentation also that some of the women may have sort of marginalized lives before this sort of co-op experience. And if the experience within the women's cooperative sort of, if you see a kind of impact or their sort of attitude around, you know, their livelihood or their work shifting because of this sort of collective cooperative experience. Those sorts of areas would be great. Thanks.
Sure, I'm going to keep my video off because the internet is not great. About Kerala, so Kerala is a state which is already quite well known in India for its strong focus on social indicators, and they have a history of socialist governments mostly, and so they've achieved a lot of advancement in education, healthcare, low infant mortality rate. And under that, they already started many women-oriented programs to reduce poverty. And the program that I was talking about is Kudumbashri, and it's really about supporting women with many different income-generating opportunities. So women work in, you know, in all kinds of fields. But very recently, they decided that agriculture was another area which could be beneficial for women. And Kerala has a problem of fallow lands because a lot of outmigration has occurred and land holdings were quite small and a lot of land was left, and land leasing was banned by the state in Kerala. So which is why a lot of people were not able to lease their lands, and so they just left it fallow. So to counter this problem, the government thought that could be useful to support women to take up and end fallowization. So this is the kind of general context under which collective farming of women started in Kerala, and it's going quite successfully. And the other question on meaningful work, that's really something that we've seen personally, because the women they always talk about how when they were wage laborers, it was just a job that they had to go and do every day, and they were not interested in it. And now we're seeing that they are excited to come to work, and they're also discovering new things about themselves. So the group has discovered that two women are very good at marketing, and they're very good at talking to consumers and talking about their experience. And some other women have learned how to do accounting, and so these kinds of new skills are emerging, and that they that they themselves have reported that they find this to be much more exciting, and that they want to continue doing this, and they also want to now bring new women from their villages into this. So there's a different kind of ownership that we're seeing with collective approach to agroecology.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. As time is gradually ticking away, I want to give the panel members an opportunity to ask questions of each other or make comments. While you maybe think about this, just reflect on the fact that earlier in the consumption context, Marlene Sahakian said it's important to look at intertwined practices, not only at sort of single acts of food eating, etc., etc. And the discussion about agroecology now suggests very strongly that it's much more than a set of sort of narrowly defined agricultural practices, but relates to the value of work, the meaning of work, big societal changes, alienation, marginalization, etc., and people shifting between sectors of society, etc., which something that I hadn't thought about in this context very much before. So is there any of the three who has a comment or a question for the others? Sort of, Chris, you're unmuting. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Ashlesha, in India. I mean, you mentioned that the women's cooperative was single women. I just wondered if there are married women or sort of women within families. What's are there forms of cooperative farming that women are able to do in that context, or what are the implications if you're in a relationship or in a family setting?
Yeah, good question, Chris. Actually, in Kerala, we see that many of the women are married women, and the government is focusing mostly on the vulnerable and poorer families, and the programs are open to one woman from each family. So in that context, the state is supporting them, and they work with the government program. But in our example, and also the example of other civil society-led efforts, bottom-up efforts, the feminist activists have tended to focus more on single women, particularly because of their vulnerability, and they feel that women from who are married have more support systems from their families, and single women are just much more vulnerable. So that's why this has been the case, but I don't think they're close to women from who are married either. And also they tend to focus on older women, particularly who don't have any social security or support, and they might be single. And some of them might have also inherited land. So in which case, if they join other women, they're able to use the land and they get support for the land, and they also get a livelihood and some kind of income. So that is the kind of context in which that's working.
Thank you. How about...
And I also have a question.
Go ahead, please.
I guess my question is for Chris. How have things changed in the Brexit context with support? Is there more or probability of support for agroecology in the UK?
Sadly, I think probably not. We've just had an agriculture bill has just gone through to replace the common agricultural policy, and there was a lot of activist attempts to get to sort of get explicit recognition of agroecology in that. I'm not familiar with the real detail of it. I mean, I think possibly there were some moves there, but it didn't really sort of find its way into the legislation. There is a much stronger emphasis on payment for public goods, so kind of moving away from sort of paying farmers just for owning land, which was kind of the case under the old policy. So there's a move towards sort of more conservation focused farming, and so you could say that agroecology could sort of fit within that. I think the bigger worry is that it was right to remove that payment for ownership, because it was essentially a very regressive payment to large landowners. But I think the smaller and medium scale farmers are going to get squeezed by it, and again, I think, as we were hearing earlier, typically the mainstream farming sector is quite an aging workforce. So in the short term, I think the sort of economic landscape for farming is looking even more bleak, and of course we don't really yet know what the kind of global trading landscape is going to look like. So in some ways I think that will, in the longer term, possibly create some opportunities for smaller scale agroecological farming. I think the land market will probably get a bit busier, and possibly it will have a depressing effect on land prices. But yeah, at the moment it's a little bit too soon to say, and there isn't very much explicit government support for agroecology. I think if it does turn out to be positive, it will be more a kind of a sort of slightly unintended result of dismantling the old system.
Thank you very much. Suzuki-san, was there anything perhaps that you wanted to ask or comment on the other two, one of the other two speakers' presentations?
Oh, it's getting dark here.
Yeah.
One thing I was wondering was, this is to both speakers. I don't know if this is going to get really complicated, but the theme of seeds, the farmers in Japan, the consumers in Japan, there are more people who are being interested in heirloom crops, but from the point of productivity, the farmers cannot stick to heirlooms too much, and I was wondering what, how the focus was on seeds was in both countries.
I can comment on that, Kentaro. One of the things that we are facing here is that while they were using heirloom seeds for some crops, particularly for vegetables, they had to start using some hybrid seeds, which were open source ones produced by friendly local scientists. But the problem was that the consumers were not very happy either with how the vegetables were looking, and so they realized that that's also a piece we need to deal with and educate the consumers that that everything doesn't have to look like it does on television, and and also the productivity problem happened, which you also described. So at the moment they're using hybrids for some, particularly vegetables. But yeah, this is something that we're grappling with as well.
Thank you.
I suppose from a UK perspective, I mean, again, there's a there's a sort of fairly small scale, within the agroecology sector. Obviously, a lot of discussion of seed and seed provenance and heirloom varieties, and there are organisations that are promoting that, but yeah, it's kind of far from the mainstream. But within horticulture, it's definitely something that's sort of developing, and there's the Real Seed Company and various seed seed saving networks of small scale commercial farmers. There's one where I live here in the southwest of England, so that's that's coming forward. There's a sort of bigger discussion about cereals, which is much more politically contentious. It's much more controlled than the situation with vegetable seeds, and there's one or two people who are sort of doing interesting work on sort of developing a more diverse cereal sort of seed genetics. Again, Brexit is kind of interesting in that with a lot of the quite tight interconnections between the UK and a lot of our seeds come from elsewhere in Europe, and we have traditionally provided seed potatoes into Europe, which is kind of that's fallen apart with Brexit. So I think the seed potato industry in the UK and in Scotland in particular is taking a big hit with Brexit, and you know, so I think that Brexit is going to probably in the longer term create an interesting discussion around seed and local seed governance, but at the moment it's you know, at the moment it's still not really a, you know, it's quite a sort of buried issue at the moment, really.
Thank you.
We're over time a little bit, and my intention was to close the discussion here, but I see one person on the Zoom chat has raised their hand. Marco Eti, can you, if you have a question, be brief and ask it now. Go ahead if you're there. If not, then I suggest you put the question.
But now it's okay.
You are. Yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I'm not good at English, but I think I'm enjoy and share this afternoon speeches. I think all the person very excellent speech. But this afternoon we are discussing about farmer culture and agriculture. So I want to know in future human should be continue farmer culture and agricultural culture in urbanization process. I hope to give some answer.
If people need or will continue to practice urban agriculture, is that the question? Yes.
Yes.
Does any of the speakers want to speculate or make statements on this?
I mean, just briefly, I could say in a UK context that, yeah, I suppose the mobilisation, you know, that there is more interest in sort of gardening and community gardens and urban and peri-urban agriculture. And, you know, I think that's really important in terms of breaking down some of the distinctions between commercial and amateur gardening, sort of getting everybody involved in food production. One of the problems we have is that the kind of green urban space is under such pressure from residential, you know, basically sort of speculative land prices, you know, tend to swallow up green urban space. And, you know, so it tends to be quite short term and fugitive and often dependent upon kind of individual champions. So it's not a kind of, you know, it's not like a real movement for kind of seriously providing you know, a significant amount of food for people, but I mean, it's really key, I think, to keep it in view and to build on it.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to leave the current interaction at that, but we'll move the discussion out of the formal Zoom platform into spatial chat in a moment. So there's some more opportunity for those who like to literally chat in a sort of an informal way. Spatial chat is surprisingly a lot of fun, I realized quite recently, so please have a try. With this, I'm going to thank the three speakers again for their interesting presentations across the globe. Very inspiring for me, at least. I'm going to look at my little vegetable plot with different eyes again tonight when I come home, or tomorrow, and slide again. And I thank the audience for being with us and for asking interesting questions. And I hope to continue this conversation well, later today and tomorrow, and then over the coming months. Thank you. Tomorrow's chair is asking me to advertise tomorrow. Says tomorrow we'll meet in a different time frame. It's in the morning in Japan from 9:30, which means that it's easier for people not in Europe, in the Americas to participate. So if you can, please join us again tomorrow.